All right, folks, let's go over what you need to study for your test on ecology and interactions. In your VIP section, we have 3 different foldables that we did this unit. We've got one that was about energy flow in the ecosystem. We have another that is about symbiosis. And we have this last one that is about the different levels looking at ecology. So from biosphere, which is a really big picture, all the way down to a single organism. And then we had notes on each of those flaps. You also should have an ecology review day stations sheet. I did not collect that, but it has questions that are similar to the questions that you filled in on the formative and similar to what you would see on your test. So identifying parts of a food chain, identifying what happens to energy as you move up an energy pyramid, and then talking about producers, consumers, all of those biological roles. As always, another great resource is your glossary. Additionally, you did a lab on predator and prey relationships, and understanding how those 2 different populations are connected will help you a lot for this test. And as always, my Phoenix website has full copies of the notes and full notes presentations, as well as review games on Quizlet and video links to this and other helpful review videos. So what is ecology? Ecology is the study of the environment, which includes both biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic means living or once living, and abiotic means not at all alive. The sun is an abiotic factor. The sun is not alive. This cactus is a biotic factor. It is alive. This fungus is a biotic factor. It is alive, but it's growing on a dead tree. This dead tree, because it was once alive, is also considered biotic. So ecology is the study of living things and non-living things in their environment. Ecology can be studied at several different levels. The biggest level we talked about was the biosphere. The biosphere is the part of the planet on which life can exist, pretty much everywhere. The next level underneath that is a biome. A biome is not a specific place, rather it's a general trend of plant and animal life as well as weather patterns and climate that you might see in different parts of the world. For example, there are parts of the continent of Africa, parts of the continent of Australia, and parts of the continents of both North and South America that have deserts. A desert is an example of a biome. Lots of animal and plant life there, regardless of if you're in an Australian desert or a North American desert, will have similar adaptations to deal with the heat and the low level of rainfall. If we zoom in a step further, we're looking at an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a specific relationship of both living and non-living things in one particular part of a biome. Taking that desert example a little bit farther, a desert would be a biome, but the Mojave Desert would be a specific ecosystem. An ecosystem includes the non-living factors as well as the living ones. If we want to look at a community, that's the next level down. We have to take out all of the abiotic factors. A community is all of the life that exists in a particular ecosystem. If we're talking about a population, we're talking about a group of many organisms of the same species. And when we're talking about an organism, we're talking about just one life form. We can model the flow of energy through any of these levels of organization by making a number of different models. One of those models is called a food chain. A food chain shows the path of energy traveling through an ecosystem with a series of arrows. A food chain only shows one path at a time. All of the energy in an ecosystem originates in the sun. Some organisms can do a process called photosynthesis, wherein they absorb sunlight energy and convert it into a usable form that can be eaten by other organisms for energy. Food chains use arrows to show energy transfer. They only show one path. The arrow goes from the source of the energy to the organism that is absorbing or consuming the energy. A food web takes what's in a food chain and makes it a little bit more complicated and also a little bit more accurate. A food web consists of many interconnected food chains. Each organism in any of these models has a role to play, called a niche or a niche. We've talked a lot already about niches or niches. These would be roles like producer, consumer, heterotroph, or autotroph. I'm going to add some arrows to make this food web make a little bit more sense. All right, so what's going on here? The sun's energy is absorbed by producers. Organisms that eat producers are called consumers. Consumers can take on lots of different levels. A primary consumer, like this butterfly, is one that eats producers. A secondary consumer, like this frog, is a consumer that eats the consumers that eats the producers. So producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. A tertiary consumer, like this snake, is one that eats secondary consumers. Primary, secondary, tertiary. Now, had we gone on a different path from the sun to the producer, to the primary consumer, to the snake could have been considered a secondary consumer. It all depends on the path that you're taking to follow the energy flow in the ecosystem. In this case, let's say that the snake is the tertiary consumer. You could also say that the snake is the apex predator because it's the top of the food chain or food web. It's where the energy ends up. Now you might be wondering, why does this mushroom have so many arrows pointing to it? Well, when all of these organisms die, their bodies will be broken down by decomposers such as mushrooms. As we've discussed before, decomposers like mushrooms and other fungi, as well as soil bacteria and some protists, help recycle nutrients throughout the ecosystem in that big cycle of life. Another model we can use is called an energy pyramid. An energy pyramid is useful because it shows us relative population sizes as we move through a food web or a food chain. The bottom level, the foundational level of any food web, is a producer. This is the widest part of the pyramid because producers are the foundation of this energy flow. They're the ones that can take the sun's energy and convert it into a usable form through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis that happens in chloroplasts creates oxygen and glucose that can be consumed by other organisms and burned through the process of cellular respiration to create carbon dioxide and water and energy in this continuing cycle. The next level up would be those primary consumers. These are the ones that are plant eaters. We might also call them herbivores. We have fewer primary consumers than we do producers because they're a smaller level of the pyramid. What this means is that there are fewer of them and that there's also less energy available. The pyramid would collapse if we had a ton of primary consumers and a very narrow base of producers. It would topple over. These primary consumers get their energy directly from plant sources. Our next level up are secondary consumers. This is where you'll find carnivores and omnivores. There are even fewer of these because they are dependent on the population of primary consumers to feed them. And at our very top, and depending on the size of the pyramid, this might be our tertiary level or maybe quaternary or fifth level or sixth level, would be our apex predators. These organisms are fewest in number because they are dependent on energy flowing from the sun all the way up through this pyramid to get to them. Those are all called trophic levels. There's a variety of ways that organisms can interact within these ecosystems, within their species and among different species. One relationship is a predator-prey relationship. This is what we discussed in our lab earlier in this unit. Every kind of organism in every kind of niche is going to be limited to some extent in growth by limiting factors such as available food, available water, competition with other organisms, predators, etc. Every population has what's called a carrying capacity. This is the maximum number of species of any organism in any area that the ecosystem can support. Let's say that this green line represents rabbits and this red line represents wolves. In our predator and prey lab, as in other simulations, we saw a slow and then more rapid increase of rabbits. And then the number of rabbits kind of leveled out. That's representing carrying capacity. That's the point at which the ecosystem can no longer really support any new life, and anything kind of extra will die because of lack of resources. We also saw that there was a very low number of predators to start. But as there's more food available, as the prey animals are increasing, we'll start to see a slow but steady rise of predator animals too. At some point, the predators will reach their carrying capacity and start to overhunt the prey, and then we'll see the prey drop off, which will of course then also make the predators drop off. The prey animals are the ones that get eaten, and the predators are the ones that do the eating or the hunting. This is an example of one of the ways that organisms can interact in an ecosystem, and it's called a predator-prey relationship. In a predator-prey relationship, one organism eats and the other gets eaten. Another interaction type that we talked about was cooperation. In cooperation, two or more members of the same species kind of help each other out for the good of the species. A great example of this that we talked about in class was that of male emperor penguins. Male emperor penguins will huddle together in times of storms to keep themselves and their egg warm, but will also do this to keep the others warm so that the penguins as a whole, that whole penguin population, can stay warm and are more likely to pass on their traits to the next generation. Because of teamwork, each individual penguin, as well as each individual penguin's offspring, is much more likely to survive to see another day than if they had kept to themselves. So in cooperation, organisms of the same species both benefit. Competition can occur between different species or members of the same species. Competition is when organisms are fighting for limited resources. An example of this might be two frogs fighting over food sources, or perhaps a frog and a salamander fighting for territory. So in competition, which is either between different species or members of the same species, two or more organisms are fighting for limited resources to enable their survival. These ideas of carrying capacity, limiting factors, and competition harken back to what we learned about Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection. This idea of change or die, or survival of the fittest, or only the strong survive, is really relevant to our studies in ecology. Only the organisms that can get enough resources and live to see another day will reproduce. Another way organisms can interact is called mutualism. This is when two organisms of different species kind of work together in a way that's beneficial to both. A great example of this would be bees and flowers. The bee gets food from the flower, and the flower gets its genetic material transferred to other flowers so that it can reproduce. So mutualism is a relationship between two different species that benefits both. In commensalism, two different organisms interact in such a way that one benefits and one is unaffected. A great example of this would be a tree and a bird. A bird needs a safe place to lay its eggs, so it makes a nest in a tree. The bird gets protection and the eggs get protection, but the tree isn't really affected either way. The tree is kind of like meh. So in commensalism, one species benefits and the other is unaffected. Another type of symbiosis we discussed is called parasitism. In parasitism, one species benefits at the cost or detriment of another. The organism that has the positive effects is the parasite, and the one that's harmed is the host. An example of this would be when a mosquito bites you. The mosquito is the parasite, it gets something to eat, and you're the host, and you get covered in bumps and feel really itchy. We learned about three different kinds of symbiosis, or living together. In symbiosis, two or more organisms live in very close contact, sometimes in or on each other. These relationships can be positive, negative, or neutral, depending on which organism's perspective you're taking in analyzing the symbiotic relationship. We learned about mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism.
Ecology is the study of living things and their interactions with their non-living environment. An organism is the smallest unit of life that can carry out all life functions and exhibit all 6 characteristics of life and meet all 4 needs of all living things. If we have several organisms together, we have a population. When we have lots of organisms of a different species living together, we have a community. If we look at this community and we add in non-living factors, like the sun, we're looking at an ecosystem. A biome is a general area of Earth that has a lot of similar ecosystems that exhibit similar patterns in plant and animal adaptations as well as weather. And the biosphere is the part of Earth that supports life. Food chains use arrows to show energy transfer. They only show one path. The arrow goes from the source of the energy to the organism that is absorbing or consuming the energy. The sun's energy is absorbed by producers. Organisms that eat producers are called consumers. Consumers can take on lots of different levels. A primary consumer, like this butterfly, is one that eats producers. A secondary consumer, like this frog, is a consumer that eats the consumers that eats the producers. A tertiary consumer, like this snake, is one that eats secondary consumers. Now, had we gone on a different path, from the sun to the producer, to the primary consumer, to the snake could have been considered a secondary consumer. It all depends on the path that you're taking to follow the energy flow in the ecosystem. You could also say that the snake is the apex predator because it's the top of the food web. As you move from the bottom to the top of the pyramid, you go from having a large population of producers to much smaller populations of predators. And a high amount of available energy, since producers can harness the sun's energy, which is immense, to a low level of available energy, because higher level consumers are dependent on what's beneath them to get their energy. Those are all called trophic levels. In a predator-prey relationship, one organism eats and the other gets eaten. Cooperation, organisms of the same species both benefit. In competition, two or more organisms are fighting for limited resources to enable their survival.